Breaking news, an Alaska man has been arrested for threatening to injure and kill 6 Supreme Court justices and their family members. 76-year-old Panis Anastasio sent over 465 messages to the Supreme Court's public website, according to the DOJ. Officials say the messages made threats of assassination by torture, hanging, and firearms, and contained violent, racist, and homophobic rhetoric. The 76-year-old is charged with 9 counts of making threats against a federal judge and 13 counts of making threats in interstate commerce. If convicted, Anastasio faces a maximum of 10 years in prison for each count of threats against a federal judge and 5 years for making threats in interstate commerce. Meantime, the presidential election is quickly approaching, and the issue that's on the top mind of voters, the economy. It's an issue where Donald Trump's campaign has been trying to carve out an edge, especially considering voter frustration over inflation.
And with inflation eating your hearts out, vote for Donald Trump. What do you have to lose?
But polls show Harris pulling even with Trump on the economy in recent weeks. Here to break down the latest from the campaign trail, White House reporter Alex Gangitano. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. There's a new Morning Consult poll out that has some interesting findings, including that voters prefer Harris's policy solutions on the economy over Trump's. What do you make of this turnaround and how the economy is going to play in this election?
Yeah, so we know that voters rank the economy as the most important issue this election, and often in past elections as well. It's a pretty consistent thought. And this polling is quite the turnaround and is good news for Harris. Basically, it's showing that she has managed to toe this line between touting the progress the Biden administration has had on lowering prices, while also acknowledging that prices are still too high and there's a lot more work to do on the administration. That's been a challenge for her, and according to this poll, voters are resonating with the way that she's been able to deliver that message. And we know that before President Biden dropped out of the race, he was getting fairly low marks on the economy, considering what he has done, what some of his policies have done in order to combat inflation and to prevent a recession that many economists thought was inevitable. This was kind of a interesting thing to pollsters at the time, because usually when the economy is improving, the president gets high marks because people are feeling good about the way that the things are for them and their families. But President Biden wasn't getting those marks. But now seeing that Harris has been able to close that gap and is largely tied with Trump on the handling of the economy, and if voters trust her on the economy, that's pretty good news for her, because something is resonating with voters.
Now, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are making big promises when it comes to spending and taxes. And according to tax policy experts and members of both parties, the candidates' plans will add trillions of dollars to the national debt. Trump is promising big tax breaks without offsetting spending cuts. Harris says she wants to increase taxes on wealthy people and corporations, but not enough to offset her ambitious spending agenda. You know, I remember there was a time when the national debt was a hugely important issue in Washington, but it seems like that is no longer really the case.
Yeah, both Harris and Trump, as you mentioned, have offered this flurry of ideas on spending and taxes, which is concerning to some lawmakers who are worried about the deficit and annual spending. And as like you mentioned, that used to be a huge concern in Washington, but some lingering concerns are still around, because Trump's latest expensive proposal is a reversal on capping state and local tax deductions. He's also proposed $8 trillion in tax cuts over the next decade, which he said would be offset by only $900 billion in revenue from reversing the clean energy tax breaks that were part of President Biden's policy. And of course, he's leaned on his idea to expand tariffs, which would bring in about $4 trillion. So those offsets aren't quite adding up to how many tax cuts he wants. Meanwhile, on the other side, Harris has called for, like you mentioned, raising taxes on the wealthy. And she also has these expensive plans like $25,000 down payment for first-time home buyers and $50,000 tax cut for small business entrepreneurs. Both of these policy platforms for deficit hawks, people really concerned about government spending, are definitely something that's giving people pause. And because experts are predicting that the annual deficit of $2 trillion well into the future, it would be caused from either of these plans.
That's one thing where both Democrats and Republicans seem to be able to find common ground, is keeping on spending. There is a new Marist poll that shows Harris up by 5 points in Michigan. Of course, Michigan is a key swing state that Trump won in 2016. Biden flipped it blue in 2020. Trump was just there campaigning this week, but it seems to be trending toward Harris in recent polls.
Yeah, those trends are very good news for the Harris campaign and definitely a concern for the Trump campaign. And I think we're going to see for the former president go to Michigan more, make more of an effort. But as you mentioned, he already has. The vice president is in the Detroit area today. So she's also been spending a lot of time in the really critical battleground state. This 5-point lead in this poll is a big gain for her. And as I mentioned, this state is so crucial in order to win, the 270 needed to win this election. It's a state made up historically of union workers. It also has a really large Arab American population. These are all critical voting blocks in order to sway this election. And so any gains there is big for either campaign. But I do think it's a state that we're going to see polling fluctuate until Election Day. Yes, it's 5 points here in an Emerson poll. She's also leading Michigan by 2 points, though. So I think it's going to be pretty tight race up until Election Day, as are most of these battleground states.
Speaking of union members, the Teamsters union surprised many yesterday when it declined to endorse the Democratic presidential candidate for the first time since 1996. The announcement comes after a poll of rank and file members showed nearly 60% support Donald Trump. Since the announcement, several local chapters, especially in swing states, have endorsed Kamala Harris. Talk about the state of play for union votes.
Yeah, so these Teamsters were withholding their endorsement, wanting to talk to their members, which historically a lot of big labor, the leadership of labor unions has been pro-Democrat, endorsed Democrat. Well, the workers, there was a split, and workers were resonating with the message of former President Trump in the last couple of cycles. Also, most notably in 2016, were resonating with his message. Harris's campaign and the fact that some of these regional groups are endorsing her, I think highlights that split, that some big groups are endorsing her. We've seen a lot of unions otherwise endorse her. But when it came down to this polling and the Teamsters saw that their members were backing Trump, they decided to go ahead and not do an endorsement, which is pretty historic. Former President Trump is really focused on getting these workers to vote for him in November, getting unions back behind him. While they backed him in 2016, like I mentioned, we saw them turning more towards Democrats and President Biden in 2020. So it's a big question of, will that hold up in 2024? And we'll see union workers resonating with Trump's message, or do some of these endorsements of these smaller groups of the Teamsters for Harris mean that she'll get those votes in November?
Yeah, and it was a major constituency for President Biden, so it'll be interesting to see if Kamala Harris can capitalize on that as well. Some Democrats are actually calling on Kamala Harris to do more unscripted interviews in the weeks leading up to Election Day. So far, her campaign has been relatively guarded. Since she took over the top of the Democratic ticket, Harris has only sat for a handful of interviews. Is that the strategy? Lots of choreographed rallies and few free-wielding interviews, or do you expect more of the latter in the coming weeks?
Yeah, it's an interesting argument for Democrats and allies of Harris, because she did a pretty strong debate performance last week. When she does interviews, she typically doesn't have gaffes or mess up. And so they're saying, go ahead and do more, because the more people see of you, the more they might like of you. And you do a great job in these settings. So they're almost curious of why she doesn't do more. And of course, from a media perspective, we would love for her to do more interviews and we get to hear from both candidates more. We know that this week she did the National Association of Black Journalists panel. That made some news, but she was, again, pretty scripted and measured during that. We know she did that CNN interview. And then otherwise, she's done an array of radio interviews, mostly focused on Latino and Black audiences. But again, Democrats want her to do more. And it's the argument that they think that voters will want to keep hearing from her if they get more of a taste of, her policies and what she's all about. But we'll see if the Harris campaign listens to those calls, or if they like this kind of controlled setting that she does radio interviews here and there and maybe one more television interview until Election Day, but keep it pretty closed door other than that.
A spending deal crafted by House Speaker Mike Johnson aimed at avoiding a government shutdown failed yesterday in the U.S. House, and now frustration is growing in the Senate over House inaction. Take a listen to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
The House Republican leadership has wasted 2 weeks, listening to Donald Trump's ridiculous claims on the campaign trail. Now that their efforts have failed, House Republicans don't seem to have any plan for actually keeping the government open. So the Senate will step in.
That House plan combined a 6-month funding deal with a proposal to block non-citizens from voting in U.S. elections, something opponents say is already law. 3 Democrats broke with their party to support the bill, but the bill was killed when a dozen Republicans bucked Johnson and voted no. Alex, what's going to happen now?
Yeah, so Schumer announcing that the Senate is going to move forward on a bipartisan government spending bill when Speaker Johnson failed to get that 6-month funding measure that you mentioned that was also tied with this voter registration reform that was a partisan measure. That's a big messaging move on Schumer's part to, step in and say, Democrats can handle this. We're the ones concerned with the government shutdown. So even if this doesn't work out, he can say, that use this as messaging on the campaign trail. First of all, government funding bills are supposed to originate in the House, but Schumer has used this argument that he's trying to avoid a government shutdown because funding for many of the federal departments is due to expire at the end of the month on September 30th. And the House has yet to unveil a Plan B after this partisan bill failed. So I think the Senate will go ahead and actually be able to pass something. But then once it returns to the House, that's another big question of if they can move the needle before the end of the month.
The Fed announced an interest rate cut of 50 basis points yesterday. Fed Chair Jerome Powell says it's a reaction to positive signs in the economy, growth steady, inflation coming down. But former President Trump says the cut, which was larger than some expected, is either a sign the economy is struggling or that the Fed is playing politics. Biden is giving a speech today where he'll highlight what he says is significant progress on the economy. How are you looking at these Fed rate cuts as they pertain to the elections?
Yeah, so on face value, it does seem like good news for Democrats and for the Biden administration, which in turn is good news for Vice President Harris. In this speech from the president today, he'll talk about the Declaration of Progress. So basically, he's saying that they've made big progress during the administration, but he's been really concerned about making it seem like a victory lap. And I think that's because like we talked about, him and Vice President Harris are concerned about making it look like the economy is great, and dismissing concerns from Americans that prices are too high. So I think he'll want to tout that he's done stuff to get to this point, but there's still more work to be done. Meanwhile, like you mentioned, former President Trump said that these rate cuts showed that the economy was struggling, or that basically the central bank was playing politics. So he's putting this out as suggesting that this is bad news for Democrats, or that the central bank is political. And we know that him and Chair Powell have a history of him getting involved and playing politics with the chairman when he was president. And then meanwhile, other lawmakers had wanted rate cuts before now. We know that Senator Warren, White House, and Hickenlooper wrote a letter to Chair Powell actually earlier this week before the rate cuts, but when they were largely expected to come, saying that the delays are threatening the economy and the Fed is behind the curve. But while some economists do agree that maybe July would have been a good time for this, they expect the next few months to be really critical on this so-called soft landing that everyone's hoping for, but definitely the Biden administration is hoping for a soft landing before the end of the year.
Yeah, and Senator Warren actually said after this rate cut that she's hoping for another 0.25 percentage point rate cut before the election. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro was hoping to celebrate a new law allowing grocery and convenience stores to sell canned cocktails. But the photo op didn't quite work out. That's because Shapiro forgot to bring his ID. Give us some background, Alex, on what exactly happened here.
Yeah, so funny story. Pennsylvania passed a new state law that basically expands access to canned cocktails. And to celebrate, Governor Shapiro wanted to go buy some. So he went to a convenience store in central Pennsylvania, hoping to buy, there's a Philadelphia based company, Surfside Tea, that has vodka in it. But then these videos and photos started to surface that he left without the intended purchase. Basically, the governor's office told The Hill that he had to put the alcohol back because he was carded and he actually didn't have his ID on him. So I went to college in Pennsylvania, so I do know they are pretty strict with their liquor laws about what can kind of be sold where. So this is pretty big news that now they're allowing some convenience stores to have hard alcohol, whereas beforehand only local stores could sell beer and wine. So it's a big change for the people of Pennsylvania, but I guess Governor Shapiro will have to wait to be able to purchase it himself.
I guess he didn't go out to the parking lot and try to get somebody else to buy it for him.
That would have been a funny video too.
I know nothing about anything like that. Alex Gangitano, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
With less than 50 days until Election Day, both campaigns are focusing their efforts in just 7 states where the race is a dead heat. According to a new survey from Emerson College Polling, support for Harris is up in Arizona and North Carolina, while support for Trump is up in Georgia and, critically, stayed steady in Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. To break down the numbers for us, we're bringing in Senior Director of Emerson College Polling, Matt Taglia. Matt, thanks so much for joining us. Starting with Harris, according to your polling, it looks like her campaign is making inroads in some of the redder swing states. We mentioned she's narrowed Trump's lead in Arizona and is now leading Trump in North Carolina, a state that just a few weeks ago was consistently polling for Trump. What issues may be pushing voters in those states to lean towards Harris?
Right. So I think there are a few issues here. So for one, the economy. So typically we've seen this as a weak point for the Democrat on the ballot. When it was Joe Biden, these voters who said that the economy was their top issue, up to about 80% of those voters were breaking for Trump. Now we see that narrowing slightly. So we see that Trump is still winning these voters, but it's about a 60-40 split versus Harris. Looking a little bit further down, housing affordability, that's 10% or so in North Carolina and Arizona. Still a major issue, especially for some of these younger voters, and Harris wins those overwhelmingly. We look at abortion access, typically good for Democrats, and again, Harris wins nearly all of these voters, and it'll be on the ballot in some of these states. Again, threats to democracy, that has changed a little bit here and there between when we've conducted these polls, but Harris is winning nearly all of these voters in some of these states. I think the one issue is immigration that is really dragging her down. In Arizona, that is the second highest issue for voters at 23%, and Trump wins those voters with 91%. So certainly some good news for Harris on the issues front, but Trump is still maintaining that lead among voters who say that the economy is their top issue, and he has a commanding lead with those who say immigration.
On the flip side, Trump is regaining some lost ground in the key swing state of Pennsylvania. His support there has held steady in Michigan as well, while Harris has actually slipped there in the polls. Both Michigan and Pennsylvania are union strongholds. And with the Teamsters now declining to endorse either candidate, are you seeing signs that Trump's messaging is resonating with union voters, specifically in the Rust Belt? And how big of an impact do you see their vote having on this election?
So it is potentially resonating. We see in Pennsylvania, where Trump is up 1 overall, the union vote is actually split. So it breaks for Harris 50%, Trump 48%. Then looking at Michigan and Wisconsin, it's a little different. So Harris is up 2 overall in Michigan, but among union voters, it's 64% for Harris, 34% for Trump. In Wisconsin, Trump is up by 1 overall, but Harris is winning union voters 66% to 32%. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag here. The economy is the top issue for all of these voters in these 3 states. And immigration, which is sort of the cornerstone policy of the Trump campaign, that comes in lower on the issue scale for these union voters. So I think that there is still some work to be done if he wants to overwhelmingly win these union voters in Pennsylvania and help turn the tide among these voters in some of these other Rust Belt states. Then I think he's going to have to land that message, and he's going to have to land that economy message among them and how he's going to be good for those jobs.
You know, this is your first swing state poll since the debate last week. How big of an impact are you seeing the debate having on these swing state voters?
Well, in the grand scheme, it might not be that much. Everything in all of these swing states, all 7 of them, is within the margin of error between Harris and Trump. We are seeing some shifts. So Georgia moved 4 points towards Trump. Pennsylvania moved 1 point towards Trump. North Carolina moved 2 points towards Harris. Arizona moved 2 points towards Harris. So as a whole, it sort of runs contra to the opinion that Harris won the debate. And that the debate had a major effect on likely voters. We just aren't seeing that here. But we also asked these voters who they think will win, not who they intend to vote for, but who they think who they think will win. And in all of these states, majorities believe that Harris will ultimately win. I think that might have been the result, at least to some degree, of her debate performance and some of the media attention that followed. But it remains to be seen. We don't see a huge effect here. Again, everything's very close and within the margin of error in all these states.
All right, that's all I got. Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Polling at Emerson College Polling. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Israeli military is striking targets in Lebanon following a series of communication device explosions that killed 37 people and wounded 3,000 others in the past 2 days. Sonic booms from Israeli warplanes shook buildings in Beirut today, and airstrikes are being reported in southern Lebanon. Pagers and walkie-talkies exploded across the country this week, targeting members of Hezbollah, but also killing some civilians. Both attacks are widely believed to be carried out by Israel, raising fears that the simmering conflict between the two countries could escalate to full-scale war. The Israeli defense minister praised the work of Israel's army and security forces. The top commander of the Israeli military is also said to have approved plans for unspecified actions in Lebanon. The spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General is urging diplomacy after the explosions, requesting all concerned actors to exercise maximum restraint. Iran attempted to share stolen Trump campaign information with the Biden campaign, that according to the FBI. Iranian hackers attempted to pass the non-public information along to various media outlets as well. Former President Trump wrote on Truth Social of the incident, accusing the Harris campaign of illegally spying on him. The Harris campaign has condemned the sharing of the information, saying emails sent to staff's personal accounts appeared to be spam and were ignored. The board of 23andMe has resigned, citing disagreements over plans to take the company private. All 7 independent directors of the DNA testing company have departed, leaving behind one sitting member of the board. The lone board member, co-founder and CEO Ann Wojcicki submitted a proposal in late July to take the company private. Wojcicki previously expressed interest in acquiring the company back in April, but the board rejected her proposal, citing a lack of committed financing. The company went public in 2021 after being valued at $3.5 billion. The U.S. has the worst healthcare system among wealthy nations. That according to a new survey by the leading health research nonprofit, the Commonwealth Fund. The analysis looked at 70 healthcare systems in 10 wealthy nations, including Australia, Canada, and the UK, focusing on affordability, accessibility, and availability. The survey found the U.S. in last place because of accessibility problems and low rankings in administrative efficiency and equity. The Netherlands came in first, with the United Kingdom and Germany second and third. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.